So what I want to do in this talk is give you an overview of the project on which this talk draws. It is a 5-year ERC project that officially started last March. So we have been going for a little over a year now. And this is a good opportunity for us to take stock and present to you some of our first findings and results. But it's also, I think, a good moment to reflect on what remains to be done and to formulate some questions that remain for us to be answered. So I will present to you our online archive, which we have created in the first step of this project and which went live actually only 2 weeks ago. This archive forms the basis of the project, and by focusing on the overarching theme of the seminar series, Trust, I want to take you on a short tour of the archive, connecting some of the entries that we have collected there to the theme of trust in particular. I will then turn to the key research question at the heart of our project, and in the second part of this talk, seek to answer that question, or at least throw some light on possible answers by zooming in on one particular example, one particular story, before charting out the questions that remain to be answered, and how this project and some of these questions also reframe the field of the medical or health humanities at large. So the research on which this talk is based draws on a project that looks at what I call the reciprocal interactions between law, the arts, and medicine. It questions how texts, films, songs, poems, plays, what I will call cultural productions moving forward. So how these cultural productions are cited in the law and what role medicine plays within them. It is a specific role of medicine at the end of life in any given healthcare system, as well as the specific legal framework in any given country, which triggers some of these cultural productions. And in turn, these cultural productions seek to influence or change legal frameworks and the role that medicine plays within them. To give you a specific and a paradigmatic example, we may have a text written by a terminally ill person in France who would like to choose an assisted death, but assisted dying is not currently legal in France. And this patient reflects in her narrative on the fact that such an option is not available to her. This text may then, in the future, be cited in lawmaking documents, lawmaking processes that seek to argue for the legalization of assisted dying. As such, that personal story and the particular role that it envisages for medicine to play at the end of life thereby enters and potentially shapes a future law. The main focus of the project is to gain a better understanding of how stories of assisted dying, texts and films, etc., are cited in what I call assisted dying lawmaking processes. And I understand the term lawmaking and lawmaking process as a multi-layered political process, as part of which an idea for a law, which can mean both legislation and or a natural law or right, is turned into a new law. And different stakeholders ranging from individuals to parliaments are involved in that process, which differs, of course, with regard to the legal system in place in any given country. And lawmaking documents, and I'm going to be using that term several times throughout this talk, therefore include diverse documents such as bills, parliamentary debates, briefings, hearings, endorsements by interest groups, committee meeting reports. So it's a rather broad definition that I use of the term lawmaking documents. And in the stories and the legal context, the role of medicine at the end of life is negotiated. And just a couple of words on how I use the term assisted dying. I use it as an umbrella term that encompasses both when a lethal substance at the end of life is self-administered or when it is physician-administered, which some have called euthanasia and or assisted suicide. We may have a chance to get back to questions around language, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be using the umbrella term assisted dying to refer to both practices. Now, there is a kind of what you may call a global trend towards assisted dying, legalizing assisted dying. The practice has been called an emerging human right. More countries have been legalizing some form of assisted dying or are currently opening political debate about it. Canada, for instance, legalized assisted dying in 2016, and I'm mentioning Canada in particular because Quebec in particular currently is, if you can call it that, the kind of global assisted dying capital with, I think, 6.6% of all deaths in Quebec being assisted deaths. But in addition to Canada, also various US states, many Western European countries have legalized assisted dying. Belgium, of course, has a long history, so does Switzerland. And your neighboring country, France, is currently discussing, or will be discussing later this month, a bill that would also legalize assisted dying, and a very specific form of assisted dying that we may get to talk about later on. I also wanted to show you this second map from the House of Commons documentation in the UK, where law changes are also currently being debated. And I wanted to show you this map too, because there is a tendency in Europe and in Canada to move from the criterion of a terminal diagnosis and even a fixed terminal diagnosis to the criterion of intolerable suffering or unbearable suffering as a criterion for applying or being granted an assisted death. And this move or expansion of criteria or move to different reasons also informs a variety of the stories that we have collected in our archive. So this brings me to the archive, what we call an archive. You may also call it a database or a platform in which we collect stories, text, films, plays, poems, songs, engaging with assisted dying. And we collect those stories that are cited in lawmaking documents, but also those that may be cited in future lawmaking documents. And this is why we call it a living or evolving archive, because a text about assisted dying, a play about assisted dying that may be published, that is published tomorrow, may be cited in a future parliamentary debate 2 or 3 years down the line. So part of the idea behind this archive is also that it is constantly being updated, and that we're actually also hoping to get hints about stories about where they are cited from the broader public. Importantly, this is a non-partisan research project, so we don't advocate for or against assisted dying. But if you look at what we currently have in the archive, there are more stories that support the legalization of assisted dying. And this is something we have debated in our team, whether we should balance out stories. But the fact is that there are more stories in support of assisted dying, in support of changing the laws. And again, we may get the opportunity to talk about possible reasons for that. So as it stands, you will currently find more stories and more entries that are written in support of legalizing assisted dying. Maybe a couple of words about some key features of the archive. We are currently a group of 8 researchers based in Switzerland, Canada, the Netherlands, and the UK. The entries include a kind of summary of the texts and films and a critical analysis of how these cultural productions have shaped lawmaking processes and public debates. And while these entries are written in English, we draw on material in English, French, German, Italian, Dutch, Flemish, Japanese, and Portuguese from currently Belgium, Canada, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Italy, India, Canada, the US, Japan, and Australia. And these are just mainly the languages that we have present in the research team. But as I mentioned, there is a tendency of this archive to be constantly growing and evolving. We currently have about 57 entries written and prepared, but only went live with 15. We'll be feeding more stories into the archive every week as we go along to keep people interested in the archive and to allow for engagement with some of these stories and to actually also give each story its own platform. But we also have a list of over 300 stories that we have collected so far, and that we will, hopefully get a chance to add to the archive as the project moves forward. And this now brings me to the theme of trust, the topic of your seminar series, because trust is a key theme in many of these stories. And of course, trust is key to the assisted dying debate in various ways. In the stories we have collected, we have first individual assisted dying positions as reflections of institutional trust or a lack of trust in the institution of medicine. Second, trust is a key topic with regard to how current legal regulations are carried out. As an example, and I'm going to be drawing a lot on the French case because it's the one I'm most familiar with and that I'm focusing on in my own research. France has since 2016 the so-called Loi Clé-Leonetti, which grants patients at the end of their lives the right to terminal sedation. And in many of these stories, we find expressed a lack of trust in the actualization of this law. So this law exists, but is often not actualized due to resource problems, for example. And this is also something which has been coming up in the recent political debate in France, but it's also a topic in many of the stories. Third, of course, trust in the doctor-patient relationship. And again, reflecting back on current discussions in France, the palliative care community in France is extremely worried that a legalization of assisted dying would open the door to medical paternalism and would potentially lead to an erosion of trust between patients and physicians and healthcare professionals. And finally, a topic, another topic at stake in this archive or in our corpus is trust in the democratic process. And again, connecting this to France, last year, France established a citizens' convention, une convention citoyenne, by which 200, almost 200 randomly chosen citizens were brought together to reflect on the end-of-life situation in France. And one of their conclusions at the end of their process was that they were largely in support of legalizing some form of assisted dying. And it is this process that has now also led to the bill that will be debated later on this month. So I want to connect this the kind of the presence of trust in these stories on assisted dying also to the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death, which was put together in 2018 to assess medicine's relationship with death, because this also picked up on the role of trust, and because, among other reasons, it was put together because of an erosion of institutional trust when it comes to dying in medicine, because as we read here, medicine continues to strive to keep patients with life-limiting illnesses alive, often beyond the point of benefit. And in our archive, actually, this is one of the primal fears that many patient writers express, and that is really at the heart of their lack of trust in medicine, this fear of being kept alive against their will. In our archive, we have categorized 4 sets of stories that engage with trust in various ways. So often the stories of assisted dying come down clearly on one or another side of the debate. Prior to legalization, the stories of assisted dying almost invariably chronicle the desires of patients to die with dignity and to be able to take autonomous decisions with regard to end-of-life choices. And these stories are written to plead for legalizing the practice of assisted dying, and they often contain fears about modern medicine, frequently generated by a bad medical experience in which they participated or which they witnessed with regard to family members or friends. And in what we call first wave stories, and these include films like the Spanish film Mar Adentro, the German play by Ferdinand von Schirach, Gott, Anne Berth's book Le tout dernier été, or also the Canadian film Invasion barbare. We find stories of individuals that advocate for a change in the law on the basis that current provisions are inadequate to meet their needs and infringe on their dignity and free will. However, following legalization, stories of assisted dying fall into several different categories. Some, and we've called them second wave stories, are concerned with the problematic effects of the law as it currently stands in any given country. In the Canadian context, for example, stories such as the documentary Is It Too Easy to Die in Canada are mobilized for social justice aims to highlight those whom the law's current safeguards fail to protect. And such stories have become symbolic for critics who warn that applicants for assisted dying feel that their lives are unbearable only because their government is not offering them the help that they need. So there is a lack of trust in the government and how it provides for these communities. Other post-legalization stories, and we're calling these third wave stories, advocate for further expansion of the law. And similar, though more controversial iterations of the rights claim of the first wave stories. And these cultural products reflect on how, for example, having a mental illness as a sole underlying medical condition or being underage makes the author ineligible for assisted dying and causes them, and thereby causes them much suffering. So the example I have on the slide here is a poem entitled A Glimpse of My Hell by the Canadian Ernst Fredrickson. And in that poem, he reflects on how devastated he is because he is not allowed to access an assisted death. And a fourth set of post-legalization stories document the realities of an existing law, and these are not rooting for the expansion of the law, but offer realist views of some of the hardship at the end of life, even if assisted dying has been legalized and is widely accepted by families and friends and the patient. Two examples I've chosen here for you is the work of the Canadian photographer Ruth Steinberg, who has documented her friend Alma Norman's assisted death, and this has led to a photography exhibition, or a recent Swiss documentary film, geht, that in both of these cultural productions engage with assisted dying without, however, and I think that's quite interesting, making this the center of their stories. But it's something that also almost happens next to the main focus, which is how hard it is to live with an illness and to face the end of life. Now, what gave the impetus to collecting all these stories is that, as I mentioned previously, many of them are cited in lawmaking processes. And this is not just a one-off, but a recurring phenomenon. And here is just a very brief glimpse of a mere selection of some of the stories and texts and films that we have found and that have been consistently cited since the early 2000s. And in our archive, we have tried to make this visible. So what you will find, I've chosen here the example of the Spanish film Mar Adentro. As I said, you get a summary and a critical analysis of the role of this film in the lawmaking process. You then also get some cross-links to other media connected to this film. So, for example, the autobiography by Ramon Sampedro, or a sculpture that was erected in his memory. And most importantly, perhaps, you have a drop-down menu where we've selected some reviews and media citations, but most importantly for this project, a list of interest group citations and lists of legal and paralegal citations where this film has been cited. And so what we actually hope for this archive to be doing, therefore, is obviously to provide us with a corpus for our research project, but to also make it a database that allows others to work on these stories of assisted dying. As I mentioned already now, they are kind of outgrowing our capacities. So in summary, what we have is this mass of personal narratives that are regularly cited in lawmaking processes on assisted dying. But our question is, what is the aim of citing these stories, and what is the epistemic status of these stories in these documents? So our current research question is how are we to categorize these citations to personal narratives? And by focusing on the example of Anne Berthe, I would like to take you across some of these lawmaking documents and show you up close some of the questions that these citations, these references to Anne Berthe's story, to her book, confront us with. So Anne Berthe was a French writer who was diagnosed with ALS, and given that euthanasia is and was not legal in France when she was diagnosed, she traveled to Belgium to die in 2017. And she documented her illness, her decision to leave France and to die in Belgium in a book entitled Le tout dernier été, the very last summer. And the newspaper Libération then ran an article, and actually that article is really at the start of this project because it caught my attention when I read the headline. So the article was entitled Pour une loi Anne Berthe, for an Anne Berthe law in 2017, and I wanted to know, so why is this called an Anne Berthe law? Now, going back to the archive, we have in the archive the entry on Anne Berthe's book, also a link to a documentary film that she produced and which documents her decision to die in Belgium. And what is still currently missing from the archive is a letter that she wrote to all French presidential candidates in 2017, and which was widely circulated, and in which she urged them to change the French law and to legalize assisted dying. Now, when you go to the legal and paralegal citations on Anne Berthe, these are the ones that we found, but as I said, there may be more. And actually, when you look at the timeline, she was first cited in parliamentary debates and in a law bill in 2017. The last citation goes up to last year, but actually the French Citizens Convention also used her story in a workshop preparing the Citizens Convention, as I recently found out, and I wouldn't be surprised if further citations of her story will need to be added after the bill is being discussed later this month. So what do these references look like when we zoom in on them? And what I would now like to do, and I hope it's not going to be too dry, because we're going to really engage with some of these documents, is to take you through them, to show you some of the complexity that we're faced with when trying to make sense of the role this story, this book, the film, Anne Berthe as a writer is playing in these documents. So what I have done is I have given you the kind of parliamentary debate or the law bill on the left-hand side, where this reference is taken from, and I've translated the relevant section for you into English. So in the first instance, Anne Berthe's story, her case, is cited as what I've called an exemplar, as one case among many famous French cases, such as Vincent Lambert, Alain Coq, or Paulette Guinchard, end-of-life cases where patients at the end of their lives have their situations have either been highly mediatized, or they decided to leave France to die in Belgium or in Switzerland. And this the way she is cited here, and that happens several times in the documents we found, makes a claim that her story is just one among many, and that this is why the law should be changed. In a reversal of the previous use of Anne Berth's story, in this parliamentary debate from 2018, her case, again, one among many, is classified not as exemplary, but as exceptional, and therefore presented here as a reason not to change the laws. So we have the deputy saying the Anne Berth's situation, her story, her case is such that we may need to change the law. However, all the testimonial evidence that we get from the palliative care community makes clear that this is actually an exceptional case, and that this is no reason to change the law. A further use of her story as evidence is when she, her story, her name, is used to back up a larger structural problem in France caused by the lack of broad availability of end-of-life care. So what is called here in this report the untenable status quo in the face of mal mourir, so the fact that one dies badly in France. And actually, if you've been following the debates over the last year, the current numbers are really quite surprising, in the sense that 60% of the French population does not have access to high quality palliative care. And so Anne Berth's decision to die in Belgium is then read not merely as a reason to legalize assisted dying, but her leaving France is understood as testifying to the fact that current end-of-life care provisions, also including palliative care, need to be changed. And that is confirmed when we look, for example, at the latest cross-country comparison of expert assessment of the quality of death and dying undertaken by the Lien Foundation and Duke University, where France has consistently ranked rather low in a global comparison, and the latest report still has it here somewhere on place 19. So Anne Berth is also used as evidence to kind of point to this larger structural problem. Staying with the theme of evidence, and indeed this is one of our key research questions, what constitutes evidence, or rather how are stories instrumentalized to constitute evidence? How cultural productions are used as evidence is seen rather impressively here, I think, because Anne Berth's choice in the question of whether and how that choice was accepted by her family is in this debate backed up not by scientific evidence, but actually by further cultural evidence. In this case, a film by Stéphane Brisé, Quelques heures de printemps, which, as this deputy claims, shows that the decision to die in assisted death can, in fact, can be well received by friends and families. And so this use of a further cultural source to back up Anne Berth's story, I think, very much shows that kind of this key role that cultural narratives come to play in these processes. Another category we have detected with regard to how Anne Berth's story is cited can be perhaps broadly summarized under the term legacy. And in this instance, it is stated that the law bill The law bill was symbolically the law bill that would have legalized assisted dying was symbolically deposited on the day that Anne Bert died in Belgium, thereby turning the bill into a way to honor her legacy. And one deputy staying here with a theme of legacy even goes as far as to state that she made the promise, the personal promise to Anne Bert to bring the bill into parliament, thereby again anchoring the debate around the legacy of Anne Bert and in fact her own emotional ties to her. This brings me to the theme of language, and I think this is one of the most interesting things that is going on in these lawmaking documents, because it kind of shows how stories and language really blends into the language that is used in these documents. So in one instance, a citation from Anne Bert's book is placed as an epigraph preceding the parliamentary discussion. And these words that are placed here, j'aime trop la vie pour me laisser mourir, are not her spoken words, but her published words, the words of her book, cited from her book. So her words, her published words as an author and thereby an authority. And again, she thereby functions as an exemplar on why assisted dying should be legalized, as well as someone whose words have a particular weight and value, and whose words will set the tone for the bill that is to follow. And I've copied the original French underneath my translation here, as I think the French term se laisser mourir is also a reflection on how Bert views the French healthcare system, and actually kind of shedding light on the fact that there really is a lack of trust in the French healthcare system, because for her, staying and dying in France and in that system would have essentially amounted to se laisser aller, so to let herself go, to not take care of herself by handing herself over to the French medical system. Staying with language, Anne Bert's use of words and one metaphor in particular is woven into another parliamentary debate, namely the metaphor poudre aux yeux, smoke and mirrors, and she uses that metaphor in her open letter to the French presidential candidates in 2017 to describe the loi Claes-Leonetti, so the Claes-Leonetti law, the law that I mentioned previously, which would have granted, or which grants the right to terminal sedation to patients at the end of their lives. And she describes this law as a kind of smokescreen used to deter attention from the fact that assisted dying should really be legalized, or should at least be the legalization, potential legalization should at least be debated. And poudre aux yeux throughout this debate in particular comes to stand for the law itself. The term is used by deputies, and so Bert's words are thereby appropriated and used to push the debate and a particular view. Indeed, what I've just called appropriation may be closer to authorship, and this gives us the explanation of why the Libération article that I cited and showed you at the beginning called it the Anbert Law, because Bert actually figures as a co-author of the law bill, and is cited verbatim. And she did indeed co-write the bill that was deposited in 2017, the Proposition de Loi. And she is therefore named as one of the writers of that bill as well. And I want to look at one such verbatim citation after the deposition of the bill and after Anbert's death, so in a later debate of 2021, as in this debate in particular, this citation is used as a kind of testimonial evidence, and yet it clashes with the context out of which it is taken. Indeed, it is actually never mentioned by the deputy in question that the words are taken out of Bert's book. And this, as I would like to show, matters. So the sentence that is cited is, "I still have one last freedom to choose how I'm going to die." And when we go back to Anbert's book, we find, first of all, in the introduction to the book, in the first chapter of the book, Anbert describes her own authorial intention and states quite openly there that the text for her is not what she calls a militant text. She calls it a literary foray onto the edges of the self. At the same time, you may say she still became a co-author of the law bill, so there is an activist nature to her writing, nonetheless. And yet, I think it does matter that the sentence that the deputy cites is taken from a paragraph that very much engages with Anbert's lack of trust in medicine. So she writes here, "I'm not handing over my life to the powerless medical profession against my will." And there is, again, this fear that she engages with throughout the book, that medicine will keep her alive against her will. But there is also a fear that she may, in France, be handed over to palliative care that wrongly promises to her that suffering can be alleviated, when she well knows that not all suffering can be alleviated. And so there is this particular fear of a medical culture that actually is powerless when it comes to her specific illness. And I think it is this context that really is necessary for understanding that sentence that then in this debate is taken out of context and kind of reduced to her making a rights claim. Importantly, in this specific parliamentary debate, various delegates refer to the fact that Anbert died, received euthanasia in a Belgian palliative care ward, thereby suggesting that the French law, a future French law, should adopt a similar role for medicine. And this is something I just wanted to flag, because the Belgium model, of course, here is only one among many. But by turning the story into such a paradigmatic story, of course, the happy ending of that story, if you want to call it a happy ending, and in Bert's book, she describes the palliative care ward in Belgium in glowing terms, and in a way, this palliative care ward reconnects her with medicine and rebuilds her trust in medicine. I think it also inscribes or anticipates a particular role that this future law should assign to medicine at the end of life. So I'm ending this part on the lawmaking documents, but I want to kind of end this section with a short view to tweets by Public Sénat, the television chain of the French Senate, regular tweets on Anne Berth's story, on her documentary film in particular, this film in particular has been recommended, has been streamed on this television. You were able to stream that film on the television chain of the French Senate. And one question that we are asking ourselves as part of the project is also, how are these films and books, cultural productions on the subject debated with regard to how pro or against legalization of assisted dying documents are weighted and balanced. And similarly, and I've said that before, a similar question is the one, when in the French Citizens Assembly, several stories were also discussed, presented to the delegates, and as part of this project, we want to ask how were these stories chosen, and were these stories balanced with other stories, with second wave or third wave stories from other jurisdictions, for example. So what stories are used to prepare future lawmaking? This brings me to some final considerations, namely, what precisely is the role that Anne Berth's story and other stories like her play in the assisted dying lawmaking process? Is her story a case like any other case? And yet her story is aesthetically mediated. Berth herself has transformed it into a book and into a film. And these aesthetic categories, which she herself highlights, are not reflected upon in the lawmaking process or in the way in which Anne Berth is cited. Berth is also used as a kind of evidence, but evidence of what kind? How does this evidence, we are asking ourselves, deal with her own authorial intention? Are the references to her in these documents merely a testimony to her legacy? And how are we to deal with the way her words and terminology has blended into the language used by deputies in some of these parliamentary debates? Is she a co-author of the bill, and has her authorship been respected by quoting from her book out of context, thereby, in a way, bypassing the important theme of her lack of trust in medicine? And also, is the happy ending in the Belgian palliative care ward that allows for euthanasia the kind of happy ending that is even possible in a French context? These are some of the questions we're currently asking, and which we want to answer by coming up with a kind of framework that allows us to assess how these stories are cited in lawmaking processes, and that ideally, I think, also allow those involved in these processes to engage in a meta-reflection regarding their own use of stories. And this leads me to some final considerations about the research project, which brings together many of the subfields I have listed here. We are engaging with stories centering around the role of medicine at the end of life, and that role is mediated through different cultural, linguistic, and legal contexts, which we seek to bring together in our online archive. In a paper published in Critical Inquiry in 2009, the historian of science, Marco Biaggioli, described the need for what he called post-disciplinary liaisons rather than interdisciplinarity. And I really like this term. And I think the project illustrates this, as in order to answer our question, namely how and why these stories are cited, we have to draw on a number of different subfields that are more or less familiar to us with regard to our own disciplinary training. What we needed to establish is therefore a temporary interdisciplinary formation geared to this question, but which in turn, I think, questions any static views of interdisciplinarity within the medical or health humanities. And I believe that in order to not turn the field of the medical or health humanities into an interdisciplinary silo, we have to seek to retain that openness and flexibility that redefines the collaborations of disciplines based on temporary formations, constructs that best answer the most urgent questions that we want to ask. So this brings me to the end of this talk. Many thanks for your attention, and please participate. You may have seen this yellow participate bottom already on some of the slides. I have not yet explained it. By clicking on that on our website, you're invited to send us suggestions for more stories or legal citations. And I want to say we have some, but not too many and not enough stories from Belgium. And we are looking for them both in Flemish and in French, and would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.